In this video, I'm going to discuss 5 opening principles which you have to know as a beginning chess player. Now the opening, meaning the first 5, 10, 15 moves, really lay a basis for the rest of our game, so it's very important to know what to do in the opening. The first opening principle I'm going to take a look at today is controlling the center. Now if you take a look at this empty chessboard, the 4 most valuable squares on the chessboard are the 4 central squares, which are d4, e4, d5 and e5. Now the reason why these squares are so good is because our pieces are often at its strongest on these squares. So if you take a look at the knight, for example, and we place it on e5. Now the reason why the knight is very strong on a square like e5 is because it has a lot of control over the board. In total it has 8 squares under its control. It has 8 squares it can go to in the future, and we can see that if we have just a game of chess, our knight is very versatile. It can attack from this position, it can defend, it can go to the left side of the board, to the right side. It's a very strong piece on this square. And if you compare that to a knight on the side of the board, let's say h4, the first thing that's important to notice here is that it is only 4 squares it can go to, instead of the 8 in the center. And besides that, it's easy to imagine that if our king, for example, on b1 is in trouble, our knight has a very hard time to actually help our defense. And the same thing goes for any attack on the queen side here, for example. If you want to attack an opponent's queen on, let's say, b8, well, our knight needs at least 2 or 3 moves to get actually into the game and help attack. So if you switch back to just a normal chess setup here, it's important to know that, again, the 4 central squares are the most valuable squares on the chessboard. I took a knight as example, but this goes for many pieces, also bishops, and sometimes even queens or rooks. They often operate at their best in the center, basically. Now, the way to control these squares is often, or the best way to do so, is with pawns. That's why the main opening moves often are e4 or d4. Because if you play, for example, e4, you immediately control one of the central squares, d5, meaning that we can in the future maybe get our knight to this square, right? If we get our knight to d5, it's on a controlled square, on a defended square. But maybe even more important is that we disallow our opponents from getting any piece on this square, right? Because if, for example, if you make some random moves, our opponent puts its knight on d5, you can simply take it, right? Pawns capture diagonally. So this is a very good reason to try and control as much of the center as possible. Now, of course, black will often try and do the same, right? The most popular move here is simply e5, also controlling one square in the center. But if our opponent doesn't do so, and for example plays a little bit more passively with e6, we often want to get as much control on the center as possible, right? Now we control both those squares as well as some other squares which are a little outside of the center but still important. And if our opponent keeps playing passively, we can even build a big pawn center controlling a lot of squares and making our position very good. Now the second rule I'm going to discuss kind of aligns with the first one. So after we make a move like d4 or e4, controlling a central square, let's say our opponent does the same, we want to basically develop our pieces. That's the rule. But we want to develop our pieces again to control central squares, basically. We want to develop our pieces towards their best square, so towards the center. So for example, if we take a look at our pieces, our bishop and knights especially right now, they're not great because the knight only has 3 squares. Our bishop here is completely blocked, it cannot go anywhere. So we want to put our pieces on better squares. So we want to develop them towards the center. So often the best positions for our knights in many openings are f3 and c3 later on. So let's say our opponent makes a move like knight to c6. We want to play knight to c3, developing towards the center, trying to control central squares. And let's say our opponent knows what he's doing and does the same. We also want to develop our bishops towards the center. So the bishops are a little bit more versatile. In most openings we want to place our knights on these squares, and our bishops have a little bit more options. I guess the best move here is bishop c4, but you can also go bishop b5, also attacking the knight here. But let's say for the sake of controlling the center here, bishop c4 is a great move, so because it controls this key central square. And let's say our opponent does the same. Well, we want to develop our other bishop as well towards the center. Of course, f4 now isn't possible, so right here I guess our best move is to go bishop to g5. And now all our pieces are kind of into the game. They are on better squares than they started on. And we can already now think about attacks, about putting a knight into the center. But it's very important to develop all our pieces before we start thinking about attacks and stuff like that. The third rule I'm going to discuss is about our king. And especially our king safety. Now, as I said before, basically all of our pieces are at their best towards the center. Well, there's one exception, which is the king, because we really don't want to use our king as an attacking piece in the opening. And we also don't want our king to be attacked in the center of the board. So we kind of want to get our king to a safe place, which is often to the side of the board. And the simplest way to achieve this is by simply, well, making use of our previous learned rules, which are controlling the center and developing our pieces. And let's say we play an Italian opening here. After black also makes a developing move, we want to castle our king to safety, which basically means putting the king 2 sides to the right and basically jumping the rook over. So we get our king to a castle position. Now the reason why our king is so strong or so well protected at the side of the board is because it has a lot of pieces and pawns which protect the king, right? All these pawns control very key squares on the king side. All these squares are under our control. Our rook does a great job at defending the pawn here, which is attacked by the bishop right now. And our knight also does a decent job at defending this pawn and also some important squares on the king side. So our king here is very well protected. Now one argument a lot of people actually make, which is quite interesting and also quite logical, is that our king is kind of boxed in, right? So if we go back one move, our king, and let's say we play a move like d3 instead, our king has a lot more squares it can go to, right? So it might seem like our king now is more safe than when it's castled. But the reality is that our king doesn't really need many squares. We just have to be sure that the squares surrounding the king are well protected. So we often, in many cases, in many openings, we just want to get our king to safety, castle short, and make sure before we go on any attack, we castle our king to safety. The next rule I'm going to discuss is about our queen. Of course, in the previous rule I discussed the role of our king in the opening, which is often to get it to safe places as soon as possible into the game, often via kingside castling. And now I'm going to discuss the queen. Now the queen is the most valuable and most powerful piece on the chessboard, right? So it's easy to think that we have to use our queen to attack as soon as we can. And a great way to show that is by showing an attempt that scholars made, which happens after e4, e5, and now queen to h5, immediately bringing the queen into the game, attacking a pawn here, also putting some pressure on f7, and here after, well, black has to defend the pawn, of course, so it can play knight to c6, and here after bishop c4, we immediately go for checkmate, right? Very aggressive, very attacking opening, and it looks pretty good, right? I mean, black is on the defense, and it looks pretty good for us. But here we can also see kind of the weak side of the queen, which is after g6, well, we have to move the queen. Now, what you often see is that players will play queen f3, still going for checkmate, very tricky, of course. But here black can simply play knight to knight to f6. And here, basically the whole attack is gone, right? I mean, white doesn't really have any way to continue the attack. It can try with queen b3, but, well, black can simply defend, right? So right here, we can already see that although we attacked as white, well, black is already quite better. Because if you look at the previous discussed opening principles, well, black has developed more pieces than us, at least more minor pieces. White also has kind of an awkward position, right? Because white, for example, cannot develop their knight to the preferred square. And black also has very quick development ahead, right? Because they can simply develop their bishop and castle. Of course, white can do this as well, but it has to move their knight to, well, not the best square, to e2, not a bad square, but we want often to put our knight on f3 instead of e2. And this, although this isn't losing for white in any ways, of course, it simply shows that black already is better here. And the reason why is simply because the queen, although it's very strong, it's also vulnerable, meaning that after any attack by our opponent pieces on our queen often has to move and has to make multiple moves, which we don't want to do usually in the opening. I will discuss that in the last rule as well. So, but the best way to use our queen often in the opening is to simply, well, not use it at all. We often want to just keep our queen on d1 and develop our minor pieces first before we start any kind of attack with our queen. The final principle I'm going to discuss, I kind of already gave it away in the previous principle, is to not move the same piece multiple times in the opening, or at least not more than necessary. Now, in a game of chess, time is very important. And the best way to show that is, well, in the opening position, right? I mean, right here, before white or black have made any moves, white is already slightly better than black. And the reason is simply because white can make the first move. Now, of course, the main opening here, which we showed during the video, is e4, e5. It's a very good opening in general. But if you simply make a little bit of a variation on it and play e3, e5, and now e4, well, you can already see that because we have to move the pawn twice to get it to e4, the evil bar will show it very quickly. Well, black is already better because we basically wasted one move, right? We could have played e4 in one move, and it already shows that if you take 2 moves to play e4, well, our advantage is already gone, which is pretty insane, of course. So we want to make sure that we use our time and our advantages white, well, as to the best of our abilities, basically, which is by not wasting any times. And this kind of showed in all the principles I showed before, is we want to develop our pieces as quickly as possible. We want to get our pieces into the game, well, as quickly as possible. Again, we want to castle our king. I didn't really do it as fast as possible right now, but we want to castle our king as soon as possible. Black, of course, wants to do the same, simply because we don't want to waste any time. We don't want to make random moves like knight g5 or moving this knight again to b5, dropping our bishop back if it isn't necessary, simply because we waste a lot of time doing so. And we don't really have the time in chess, which is the most important about this principle, of course. Well, those were the 5 principles I wanted to share in this video. I hope you guys learned something from it. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel to see more of this kind of content. Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you next time.